speaking of formative life experiences and growing up and hidden economic forces, one of the things I learned from this book is that when I was performing as a California Raisin at the age of 6, I was actually participating in a government psyop, basically. Explain that.
Wait, no, you explain that. What? You were a baby raisin?
I don't remember a lot from my childhood, but I do remember putting on a purple swimsuit with big white gloves and singing I Heard It Through the Grapevine as part of some school production.
That is fantastic. I don't think I would be invited to do that, but I do feel like I would remember if I did.
Yeah, that does feel formative. I love that.
So California Raisins, though, they were part of a, government-induced ad campaign for raisins. I had no idea. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal.
Joe, you and I have talked about doing a book at various times.
Yeah, I talked about it.
That's pretty much it. We talk about it and then we get a few emails from agents and publishing houses.
It's so much work.
And then we get distracted.
But the one thing I was thinking about is maybe that idea for a recipe book.
I would totally do that.
May be one that we should consider at some point.
A cookbook / supply chain.
Yeah, about the food in each one, the business of it.
I would totally do that. I have some good recipes too. All right. So we are actually going to get our acts together and do this. Okay. Well, our guests today are people who have actually gotten their act together to publish a book while running a highly successful podcast. It is, of course.
So we're going to learn. We're going to learn what to do.
That's right.
We're going to take notes during this.
That's right. Actually, someone who's written 2 books now, so I don't really know how she does it. But the through line in all of this is, I'm just going to say it. We're going to be talking to one of the Planet Money co-hosts and then a longtime contributor to Planet Money, and they've written this new book called Planet Money, A Guide to the Economic Forces That Shape Your Life. And one of the through lines that I think we share between Odd Lots and Planet Money is this idea that there are all these hidden economic forces that basically dictate the way we live.
Totally. I mean, there's been especially the less, it's always the case, right? But especially in the last several years, which is just the sort of the invisible becoming the visible.
Yeah.
Which I guess they're not, are they? We see how they shape their life, but there are all these things that we take for granted, et cetera. And now they're in our face and we're only scratching the surface of what we know about them.
Right. We all became supply chain experts during COVID. We became trade experts during 2025. And now we're all going to become commodity experts, given the Iran situation as well. Well, without further ado, we do have the perfect guests.
That's right.
The people who actually wrote the book. We're going to be speaking with Alex Mayassi and Mary Childs. So thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots.
Thank you for having us.
It's such a pleasure to be here.
It's an honor to finally be the perfect guest.
Oh, you've been the perfect guest before.
I know, but now it's like the sun is shining on me. Do you know what I mean? I'm the perfect guest.
All right. So why a book and how did you manage to do it between your actual day job of podcasting?
Well, this one's easy for me because I did almost no work. Alex did all of the book work. And so that's what I would recommend in terms of division of labor is to not do the work.
Okay.
That's my
specialization still has a place.
I think that's
right. This is good advice, I think.
Yeah. So just have a friend who's a longtime contributor. But basically, I think a lot of our work feeds itself, and it's such a different medium, and writing and processing, the way that you synthesized some of the episodes is kind of crazy because it's a story in a totally different way. But yeah, it's a very collaborative team effort is what I would say.
Why don't you talk about your process, Alex? And again, as the one who apparently actually did all the work. I don't know. Tracy and I are going to have to play rock, paper, scissors if we ever do this. Which one actually has to do all the work?
Write the book, or does the loser write the book?
I don't want to write. I'm busy enough.
Because I feel like I won, but
Well, okay.
Enjoy,
I'm too scarred from my experience.
But it's all right. Intuitively doing the reporting for the podcast, et cetera, you encounter a lot of things, and assembling some of these big ideas into a book makes sense. But then again, the actual process. So how do you go from thinking about, okay, here are all these things you talk about and learn about, et cetera, to putting it on paper kind of?
Yeah, I think probably the first big decision was really coming up with a kind of organizing principle for the book. And so one of the early ideas we had was to think of this book as a field guide. You can imagine leaving your house in the morning and tucking it under your arm to help help you as you experience the economic forces outside your door. And, then from there were some different ideas we had about how to structure the book. There was some thought to maybe start with kind of like your younger years and then increasing sections are as you get older, kind of then retirement. Then we were like, we do end in death, which sounds a little morbid. But then again, I loved the idea of an epilogue about the economics of graveyards, which is a fascinating topic. But ultimately, we structured the book as kind of about different parts of your life, such as some expected ones, working career, saving and investing, and some that are maybe a little bit less expected, like leisure, as well as, love and family. And so I think from there, with this idea of kind of a field guide to the biggest economic forces that shape your life, that impact you, that kind of gave us, and gave me in particular, some ability to kind of look at both, some really classic Planet Money episodes that we thought we'd really love to get that story in the book, as well as new ideas I had, other members of the team had, and be able to kind of have some sort of, filter or criterion to say like, okay, what belongs in this book and what doesn't.
Okay, so speaking of formative life experiences and growing up and hidden economic forces, one of the things I learned from this book is that when I was performing as a California Raisin at the age of 6, I was actually participating in a government like psyop, basically. Explain that.
Wait, no, you explain that. What? You were a baby raisin?
I don't remember a lot from my childhood, but I do remember putting on like a purple swimsuit with big white gloves and singing I Heard It Through the Grapevine as part of some school production.
That is fantastic. I don't think I would be invited to do that, but I do feel like I would remember if I did.
Yeah, that does feel formative. I love that.
Okay, so California Raisins, though, they were part of a, I guess, government-induced ad campaign for raisins. I had no idea.
Yeah, and this is, agriculture, right, is an unusual sector. And one thing is that is unusual about it is that there are cases where there are government-sanctioned cartels, like blessed by the power of the federal government, and in fact, enforced by the federal government. If the government is often trying to prevent different businesses within a sector from, collaborating to try and fix and increase prices. Instead, in some agricultural sectors like raisins, the U.S. government has historically, made an agreement with the raisin growers and said, okay, you are able to form, a cartel, or they often might use words like cooperative, so that you can collaborate as an industry.
So much nicer. I never really thought about how different that word lands. It's like, oh, we're part of like a dairy cooperative. It's like, oh, that's great.
But cartel is just the word for group in Spanish. Like, I feel like that's unfair to the word group.
Yeah, and economists certainly like use the word cartel like non-pejoratively. That's just like what's happening here. But you're right. Like when you think of like a dairy cooperative or these different cooperatives,
really nice.
They are,
they're all friends here.
They are businesses all working together, often to restrict supply and increase the price. And that's what was going on with the raisin cartel in California, centered in Carmen, where lots of raisins are grown. And I think the economic logic for it is like, there are things about agriculture that are hard. Sometimes you have all these small farmers that are going to sell to a few processors or, dairy markets. So you want them to kind of have leverage almost like a union.
Yeah.
There's also a way if you have a bumper crop one year, then you get a low price. But then the next year, if you have like a really terrible crop, I mean, maybe the price is higher, but like you don't have as much to sell. So there's this way that the government sees value in allowing them to cooperate to kind of smooth out the supply. And that's what was happening with raisins. It also meant that when they had this organization that was responsible for managing the supply of raisins year to year in an effort to kind of smooth things out, but also boost the price, they also advertised. And so, like their big coup was like like these singing raisins. And apparently you
Tracy
were one
Alloway.
of them.
Right.
Why didn't I know this 2 years ago?
Now, this is like really interesting. Also, again, like milk is another one of these things that was like collectively advertised for years. There's like the drink milk campaigns with like milk mustaches that all the celebrities wear. But it's interesting just musing on this a little bit further because we've done a fair number of episodes about like agribusiness and gigantic, like really powerful, nationwide entities, and whether it's chicken or restaurant supply, et cetera. Of course, like a really large company, they solve the coordination problem by being one company, right? And there's no they can pass pricing, there's no law, as far as I know, that says like the West Coast manager can't coordinate on prices with the East Coast manager, et cetera. But then you have like these independent entities like a farm, et cetera. And if they can't, intuitively, if they can't coordinate on some level, whether it's output and price, then how would we ever expect smaller companies to compete against gigantic companies that, have that ability to do internal coordination?
I just love that it's like, how did we pick raisins? Are raisins so important? Am I supposed to be eating way more raisins?
I mean, some people would have strong opinions on that. I mean, I think raisins were a big deal. Like
it's a really big
these
deal.
raisin farms had really like kind of boom years, like during World War II. They were growing lots of raisins that were bought by the federal government to send to the troops. And yeah, I think like probably I'm going to, this is not, I've not done deep dive on this, but I'd also just assume, right, like the same way that like children used to receive an orange for Christmas and be happy about it. I assume also that like the sweetness of raisins was much more impressive when we were not just bathing in sugar on a daily basis.
Now you're the neighborhood villain if you like give out raisins for Halloween or something.
Sorry, just to be clear, is it still the same market structure for raisins?
It has changed for raisins.
Okay.
And, the story in the book, and this one comes from like a classic, amazing Planet Money episode, is about two farmers. I mean, they're a couple, ran their farm together. And, there was a year in the early 2000s where, the leadership of the cartel said, okay, this year everyone's diverting 47% of their crop. So not selling it, and instead it goes to the cartel, which in theory, we'll save it, sell it later, and then pass money back. But in practice, these farmers felt like this decision just kind of comes on high down to us. We're not involved. And like, they spend a lot of that money on, sometimes marketing coups like that California raisins, but other things, administrative costs that they didn't necessarily see a huge benefit from in their opinion. And so they decided they felt that they'd found almost a legal loophole where if they did certain aspects of like packing raisins themselves, they felt that they therefore were not covered by the legislation and had to be part of the cartel and could sell their entire crop themselves. This led to like a stakeout, and like someone like a PI named Rocky, like getting video footage of raisins leaving their farms that could then be used in a court case. And this ultimately went all the way to the Supreme Court.
And
imagine staking out raisins.
And so it was then which way did the Supreme Court basically ended the raisin cartel?
Yeah, because some earlier decisions found against these farmers, the Horns, and they would have had to pay a lot of money, and the cartel would have endured. But the Supreme Court sided with them, said that, this is more or less kind of like a taking of property situation, and that this should not be enforced by federal law. And so the cartel still exists, but more as a kind of organization that maybe does, coordination, maybe advertisements, but that farmers like the Horns are not compelled to divert their raisins to anymore. So it really changed the system.
Defanged the cartel.
You briefly mentioned oranges, and this is the other thing I learned. Well, I learned many things from this book, but one thing that stood out to me was this idea that you have cuties, the oranges, like the orange brand, and you think that that's one particular variety of oranges, but actually it turns out that sometimes it's different fruit. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was something really fun to do with the book, that like we had this amazing episode about, these raisin farmers, the raisin cartel. You can learn about, cartels in agriculture. But for the book, there's also this opportunity to show like, oh, this really represents kind of like the commodity trap, right? Like companies are always in competition, and in a state of like perfect competition, basically their profits go down to zero because they're all busy trying to lower their price, make a better product, which is great for all of us as consumers, but not great if you want to make a profit. And so like, how do you get out of that? A cartel is one way that you may be able to boost your price by having like managing the supply and having pricing power. It was really interesting, like the farmers in the episode and that I spoke to, it turned out they kind of had their own idea. Like they almost wanted to do it in their own way. They wanted to escape the commodity trap in their own way. So one of them was experimenting with like, he wanted to sell his own like raisin snack packs, and he was putting like spicy stuff on his raisins or doing some sweet mixes. And like, that was kind of his dream was to sell those. And then I think, branding is another way, right? That companies are able to have pricing power, customer loyalty, and so on. And so it is interesting, like agriculture, part of the reason you have cartels is because it's really hard to have any pricing power there.
Yeah.
But this is one of those ways that like with cuties, they achieved brand recognition and pricing power. Like there are other times I get some other clementine and I don't like it as much. And then so the next time, like I look for the cuties and I buy the cuties, and they probably charge a little bit more. And I'm okay with that because it's a dependable product that I like. And they did it by creating, this cute, like cartoonish character that I think many of us have seen on the packaging. And so that's, I think, and to your point, like it's actually not always the same fruit in the bag because obviously like fruits go through cycles. And so, kind of when the harvest for one ends and they run out, then they switch to a similar one, but under the same brand name.
That's truly successful branding when you have a different product, but it's still recognized as the same thing.
It's just trust us.
Yeah.
Just don't worry about it. You're going to be safe.
I don't know, this conversation is like really making me think generally about how, to some extent, rare, like true, like free market capitalism is in a lot of different industries. And whether we're talking about really big entities like OPEC came up, or whether we're talking about Raisins or et cetera, it's really hard to have sustainable industry without some level of coordination, especially if there's like a commodified element to what's being sold.
Yeah, if you want the end result to be that your society definitely has something, there needs to be some degree of like stability, dependability, regulation, something in there to make sure that it's smoothing those market cycles.
Yeah, and I think this is why like a field of economics that I'm really interested in is market design. Because I think, right, like market design started with some of these case studies of just really unusual goods. As like a lot of listeners might know, like kidneys is kind of a canonical example. Like we're not going to, I think Iran is the one place in the world where you can buy and sell a kidney, but most of the world, the United States, we're not going to buy and sell kidneys. So like, how do you match people up? How do you make those quote unquote transactions happen? But I think market design, with the growth of this field, it's also, reached into other things where there certainly are prices. And I think it's also leading to more focus on, as you say, the way that this kind of like laissez-faire market that's almost feels like it just sprung from the earth full form is like, not really a thing. There are often rules being made, sometimes very intentionally, sometimes, kind of sporadically and random. But, I just think about the fact that like Wall Street and finance is a kind of, probably most people's main image of like a bastion of pure capitalism. But like they literally have trading hours and they like close for the day, or they have kind of like circuit breakers, right? Where we stop trading.
They have and they're not necessarily that onerous, but they have, there's various I forget the tests that people have to take, the certification tests and FINRA, and like certain of these like bodies that regulate who can get in and so forth. Like they play a similar like coordinating role.
Also rules like on insider trading.
And rules
things like
on
that.
insider trading. Yeah.
It's also I was just thinking while you were talking about Al Roth, like the guy, the kidney guy. I feel like the way that he sees the world is like you actually have markets everywhere, and you are choosing to see them or not by what you regulate. So like it is always a coordination problem, and you're just like, if you aren't regulating it and allowing this market legally, then you're allowing it in the black market, and that's also a choice. And you're accepting whatever negative externalities come with that. Like in Prohibition, it was like, well, you have to buy your liquor from a gangster and maybe get shot. Like, is that a good social structure? Do we like that? And we didn't like that. So And
it also led to the overproliferation of speakeasy bars in wealthy cities around the world.
Yeah.
You mentioned society earlier, and one topic that I think we've both done podcasts on before, and it's a big chapter in your book, is childcare.
Yes.
Which is a sort of great demonstration in the overall economy of how the prices of goods keep going down. Like TVs are cheaper than ever and bigger than ever. Meanwhile, childcare just seems to be this like basket case of a service, and the cost keeps going up. What did you learn from that chapter?
That's one of my favorites for obvious reasons. I think it's like it's such a problem that we have across our society that like is a problem that came of good things. Like economic progress means that like everybody's got jobs, everybody's wages are going up. The prices for a lot of these goods, as we have technological advancements and improvements in efficiencies, the prices go down, and that's fantastic. Our phones get smarter. No one buys cameras separately anymore unless you're literally a photographer. And then that means that like all these tech salaries are going up, and labor is getting more and more expensive. And so kind of meanwhile, across the economy, there are all these jobs that are not scalable, that are just like people jobs where you have to do them with your hands, and they're kind of like bespoke, and they're just not, you can't make these same kind of technological advancements and make the cost go down. And so there's this like weird inelasticity there. But those people doing those jobs are like, I'm making $20 an hour doing childcare or singing on Broadway. And like, great. but I could be over here like thinking more about chips and, you know, making these technological advancements and like feed my family and then some. So what am I doing? And so they migrate over, which makes the labor supply harder in the childcare sector. And you just get this like, it's just like kind of a broken system. And so daycares, childcare centers have to operate at like razor thin margins just to be able to get, even though it's so expensive. Like
Wait,
it's
say more on that,
crazy.
because I've never understood this. So like everyone is paying insane amounts for childcare.
Literally insane.
And the childcare centers don't seem to actually make that much money off of it.
That's correct. So you just like, it's such an empirical question. You just go and you stack up each thing. And it's like, okay, you got to pay for the real estate. You got to pay for the insurance. You got to pay for the labor so that like the people are there. And then you're just out of money. Even though there are wait lists for longer than the duration of childhood, right? Like you get on a wait list and like, I think I'm still on wait list for my 5.5-year-old who's now in like kindergarten. I'm like, I just didn't get in, I guess. I know. And like, but that's because they have to keep these wait lists in order to say like, okay, to keep their spots filled so that they can kind of operate like they're basically offering their services at a discount, which is wild because it's so in demand and they should be able to raise prices. But there's also another thing where like, because the family making the choice to put their kid in daycare, they have an out. They could just, one of them could drop out of the labor force. So that ends up putting a cap on how much you can actually charge. So it's like broken on in a few different ways. And what ends up happening is like, you just need intervention. Like if you want this to be a service, you need intervention.
That's interesting. I actually had not thought about that element that if you hit a certain price, then one of the parents, usually the mother, will just drop out of the workforce and do it, which is not the same case with healthcare, right? So, you know, it's like, yeah, like a doctor, right, like they, you know, you keep raising the price of some, you know, a heart transplant, et cetera. It's like, okay, you know what?
Not going to DIY
I'm just going to get into heart surgery myself and do this my own. And like, that's never going to happen. But that's an interesting dynamic in terms of like what puts a lid on the potential for, I guess, margin expansion.
Yeah. And our brilliant colleague, Sarah Gonzalez, calls this like baby's first market failure, right? Because you have like, everyone's like, I'm willing to pay so much money and yet there are lines everywhere. Why are there lines? That's a market failure. And it is the fact that there is this kind of cap on the price. And therefore, because people have the alternative, the may not be ideal of dropping out of the workforce, you know, one member of the couple. And so, you know, that's why we're in this place, like really long lines, a market failure.
One thing that I think about a lot is, you know, I went to like an elite university and, you know, I've been, thank you. And, you know, I've like in my career, I've been around like a lot of people, well-educated, et cetera. It's like the number of people who I would call like peers who like ever went into education, setting aside just childcare, but like became a teacher. Like, I know like one. Like it's really extraordinary, you know, like one person I'm friends with who like became like a public school teacher. And it's just extraordinary to me, the degree to which this career, which many people think is like really vital and important to society. And of course, like public school teachers, an element of their job is childcare, as that's where people like how disconnected that is from people who have had like the privileges of like myself and all these people I know, just like never like think about going into that as a career option. I mean, do you know many like public school teachers that like you went to college with or anything?
No, and I absolutely have a friend who like works on the tech side of finance, and you're like, he would be such a good teacher.
Yeah,
and he probably would do it.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, this kind of dynamic we've been talking about, like it's commonly known as cost disease.
Yeah.
It's kind of the name for it, this way that like these parts of the economy that look very similar, they're very labor intensive. They look very similar to the way they did 50 years ago, maybe even 100 years ago. They don't have those kind of crazy productivity gains of factories, of software. It's a very simple idea, but it can't explain so much.
Yeah.
And I think one kind of implication of it is that a lot of labor intensive services are things provided by the public, by the government. So, you know, public schools, policing, firefighting. There are technological improvements there and gains to be made for sure, but they're very labor intensive. And I think part of the reason why, you know, teacher salaries are low and budget squeezed there is because of cost disease. And it's, you know, I've absolutely like spoken with people in firefighting where this is a big problem that like their labor costs keep going up and lots of places have not therefore also increased.
Yeah.
You know, we're not all thinking about cost disease all the time and being like, of course my taxes need to go up. X% a year to account for cost disease. But like,
Maybe
if
we
you
should
don't,
be talking about it.
I think we should be talking about it. Like, if you want to make sure that like people can go into firefighting, go into teaching, you know, make a solid wage, afford to live in, especially the really successful cities where there is a lot of growth, that is great, but also makes cost disease even worse. Like, it is important to think about. That's a very, very strong argument for public subsidies, or, you know, the government providing the service and, you know, increasing taxes potentially to
I like
pay
that.
and fund for these things.
That line at the end of the chapter is basically just like this. It's a good thing. The sign of your economy doing well is that your taxes go up forever. It's like, whoa.
That's definitely an optimistic way of looking at it, for sure. Well, one like thought experiment question I had on this was, does AI start to change this equation at all, in the sense that, okay, the problem here is that you have a bunch of childcare workers who see other industries that are making big productivity gains and higher salaries, and they can leave. And then if we have AI come in to all these sectors that typically see a lot of productivity gains, like software or other white collar jobs, does some of that leakage start to stop?
I love
Basically,
this. Like,
the question is,
it's like a reverse backlash AI
it's like
optimist.
it's like a bunch of people are going to have to get into home health care because
which
they
we
lose
kind
their
of
white
already
collar job.
see, right? Like most new job creation in the U.S. has been in the healthcare
But is
sector.
it going to be like, oh, yeah.
But I think that's not wrong. Like, because all the AI disruption, collapses a sector of the economy, of the labor market. And then those people need jobs. And so they go into the things that are bespoke human hand jobs, like childcare and home. I love it. I love it.
This has been my joke idea for a website I want to vibe code, which is, and I'll just say it because it's not actually.
Just say it.
No,
I feel like you've already said it. Was it on a podcast or just to me?
There's basically a website, and you like enter, and it's like, what is your career? What is your education level? And and how many years have you worked? And then it's like, okay, what will your job be post AGI? And you click it, and everyone just gets returned the same answer: home health care aid. Like that's sort of it's just like it's just a joke.
But
it doesn't matter what it is.
Yeah,
that is
it's gonna make one joke, one academic point, and do it well.
Maybe I'll make it. Maybe I'll.
You should.
You should.
But
really
I think I kind of have a pitch here. So whoever will be like the overlords in our AI future, like, please consider my pitch.
Okay.
But like, you know,
ChatGPT, if you're listening,
yeah,
you know,
that was a good prompt.
like I think it was kind of required in like, I don't know, the aughts, the early 2010s, that whenever someone wrote about a 4-day work week or basic universal income, you would talk about how John Maynard Keynes made this prediction about, you know, I don't remember exactly how far out, but, you know, in X number of decades, you know, we'll be so much richer. This will kind of be our living standards.
Abundance.
And therefore we'll be working way fewer hours.
Yeah.
And famously, he underestimated how much wealthier Britain would get, as well as other countries like the United States. But of course, he greatly overestimated the idea that he thought we'd be working like 20 hours a week, 10 hours a week. But of course, like working hours have stayed quite high. And I think a point I've seen, and I'm sorry, I forget who made this point first, but that I thought was really smart, was like, well, it's not, we're not all working 10 hours a week, but now like children in the vast majority of the world don't work.
True.
And retirees retire. So like we made choices so that, you know, some people could work less and could get an education or have a secure retirement. And I do think like, if we are going to, I don't know if it's coming, but if we are contemplating the potential of a world that has so much, you know, intelligence on demand, so much automation and so much abundance that we like, in theory, don't know what to do with ourselves, like perhaps allowing parents to not be like, man, I could barely afford childcare. Do I drop out? And it feels like a terrible choice. And instead be in a place where it's like, it's a social norm that like we are wealthy enough that people can drop out to take care of your children during formative years. Like, that's a vision I would love to see people express with excitement more.
Can I push back just a little bit, which is...
As a person who's
push back on the
that
joy.
sounds so nice, but I care too.
No, I mean, I agree.
Let me
but like
work.
in defense of Keynes, because I've thought about this a lot, which was like, you know, think about like what, quote, work meant when he wrote the book. Or sorry, when he was writing that. Yeah. And now think about that, like there are those of us who have like jobs literally like writing books and talking and stuff like that.
He's like, that's fun, bro.
I'm just saying, like, does it really, compared to like what Keynes had in mind when he talked about work and labor and toil versus what so many people do in the knowledge, does that even like count as work in some way? In other words, like a lot of people really like their jobs these days in a way that I suspect was not the case when Keynes was writing. And so it's like, are people who like their jobs even, quote, working 15 hours a week half the time?
I never have to go into a coal mine. I
Yeah,
never
that's what I'm
have
saying.
to lose a finger on a sewing
This
machine.
is what he was talking about when he was talking about work.
Yeah.
And now there are a lot of people that literally never have to do any hours, let alone 15, but any hours of work. Now, I understand that's not everyone.
But those are the jobs that are most likely to be disrupted by AI. Right?
I was just saying, like, I think like Keynes might have been more right that he gets
I think these
for.
are two good defenses of Keynes, but the point that like there's a lot of, there's a lot more leisure time, which is now people actually retire and they're not like toiling in fields because they're insecure. And the fact that a lot of people, are getting like self-actualization from their job. And that feels like a story of progress as well.
Well, actually, on this note, I mean, there's a lot in the book that is framed like very optimistically. And you make a lot about, human advancement and the idea. There's the famous chart in there of like how much you would have to work in order to afford like a certain amount of light over time. Like there's a lot of human progress in this book. But if you look around in 2026, certainly in America, it doesn't feel like that's necessarily translating into the general vibes. There's this sort of like nihilistic sense of wealth building and economic advancement and people just sort of giving up and thinking that the system's rigged against them and that they're never going to be able to afford a house or whatever. In your view, as the authors of a whole book on, a guide to economic life, is that a failure of like storytelling about how the economy works? Or is that sense, that vibe shift, an actual reflection of like secular stagnation in the way the economy works?
Well, my bias would be the latter, but I didn't write the book, so I do want to let you answer first.
I think my inclination is like, yes, like both.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's both. I think the fact that I think we see in surveys that people often think that the average American is working more than ever, when in fact, we have seen not huge, but modest decreases in the amount of time that the average American works. There's often a lot of sense that the average American or median American has become much worse off. That does not match up with statistics. So I think there is absolutely some, like whether it's built in or not, there's pessimism in there that's perhaps, maybe it's something about human nature, maybe it's something about storytelling, and maybe this book can help, be a positive force in that respect. But I also think like, this book is absolutely, has chapters talking about big challenges in places where, we have housing shortages, and that's often from people making selfish choices, ones that are rational and understandable, but that lead to, this problem of housing shortages, high rents, people not being able to afford home ownership. There are other examples. I think also a way I think about it is, right, like we have the hockey stick chart growth of like the global economy over the last 200 years, and it's incredible. But at the same time, like, I feel that way. I feel anxiety, anxiousness. I don't feel fully secure and optimistic about everything.
You're not happy that you can like flip on a light switch and get hours and hours.
I do,
of
but the hedonic treadmill, and then I forget about it.
Yeah.
But I also think it's, it's maybe that way where it's like you can be somewhat comforted by the incredible story of progress we are part of. But probably if we all took that for granted, would the progress continue? And it feels kind of similar. I don't know if you've had experiences, right? Like you're working on a project and you're nervous about it and you're tense. And okay, well, I'll just put this in first person because it's true of me. You can tell me this is true of you, but like you're working on a project, you're tense, you're nervous, you're stressed about it. And as many times as I tell myself, you've done similar projects like this before, you figured it out, it went really well, it probably will this time too. I'm absolutely going to be anxious and stressed for quite a bit of that time. Some good moments too, but I will have those, that anxiety and whatnot. And like, maybe I could get to a place where I'm just blissful the entire project, but probably some amount of that stress and anxiety is required. And if it wasn't there, I wouldn't actually get to the good outcome.
I feel in my head, it's like, oh, I'm so blessed. I can turn on a light switch and I get light and I can afford raisins and all this stuff, and like, and then like, and you hear people say like, oh, well, you can like get penicillin, and like, the king of England 200 years ago would have died from this infection, whatever. I understand that in my head, it does nothing for me on my gut.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, I get that. And I appreciate it. Great. I love living.
This is the cost of free donuts.
But like, it does not do it. It does not actually like on any like real emotional level make me happy. It just sort of like I like intellectualize.
We have a Planet Money episode for this. This is the cost of free donuts. Once you start getting something for free, you will not pay for it. So it's not the exact, but like you have these things already.
Yeah.
You do not delight in their arrival every time.
No,
Although I do
yeah.
delight in the arrival of amoxicillin. Like I feel like actually.
No, it's just this whole thing. It's like, oh, be so appreciative because think about how like the king would have been so jealous of you. It's like, great, but that's still like I'm exhausted at the end of the day and all this stuff. Like it only goes so far.
And I think there is a disconnect between like, you know, we've had life expectancy like peak in this country and things there does seem to be some kind of sea change in how our trajectory is going. I think we can accept that we're way better off than we were 100 years ago. We're not all dying in the mines. Children aren't working. Like this is all great. But I think that there in the past 5-10 years, there is this sort of, I don't know, there's a hollowing, the inequality stuff, the rise of AI and the like future that we all know is going to be very different. That we're in the middle of this enormous transition. I think we all can accept like the disconnect between consumer sentiment and the data suggests that the data need updating. Suggests that like we're not quite collecting in the way that we need to be. There's something missing.
Yeah.
And I mean, not to get Derek Thompson, but I do think a lot of it is societal glue and we lost the habit. But like what else and how do you measure those things?
And I think also, you know, we talked before about how often people's survey responses suggest that they think, you know, wages have gone way down when in fact it's gone up. But also like that almost maybe captures a more fundamental truth that like people are right that like the average worker is not benefiting as much from economic growth in the US as they used to. And so, you know, if the sentiment that like things have just gotten worse and worse and worse is not quite true, it's absolutely true that like gains are no longer as broadly shared. And there's a lot to like think about that.
I think this is key. Like I think humans have a innate tendency to look at relative gains versus absolute gains.
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah.
And so you see that like come to the fore right now. All right, I think that's a great place to leave it. Maybe.
What? I thought we were just getting into it.
Thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots.
Thank
really
you for
appreciate it.
having
And
us.
congratulations on the book. The book again
Thank
is
you.
Planet Money, A Guide to the Economic Forces That Shape Your Life. Joe, that was really fun.
Yeah, I love catching up with them. That was great.
And it is genuinely like I haven't read the full book cover to cover, but I have been flipping through it and like just the number of interesting things that you can pick out, like the oranges thing. Fascinating.
No,
also, sorry, I forgot to ask Alex this, but like one of the few people I found that actually shares my like obsession with insurance as a potent force in not just the economy, but in society.
I have an insurance thought that I'll share with you afterwards for maybe a future episode. But I think like I find these kind of conversations really interesting and helpful because like it's like sort of like pretty core ideas. Like, okay, like what is the issue with childcare? Or what is, you know, what do agricultural cooperatives / cartels, like what problems they actually solve? How much are we actually working and why have we gotten so much richer, but, you know, people are still like
we
workaholic.
feel bad about it.
Et cetera. Like these are like pretty big questions. And it's pretty obvious, like they sort of like, if you like think about them, you can get to like some interesting places.
Yeah.
And so it's good to sort of just like zoom back and like think about some of these things for a while.
Also, to your point, it kind of illustrates once again, like all the decisions that go into the economy in the sense that like the economy is often pitched, at least in America, as this free market thing that just kind of exists and like is automatic in many ways and just does its own thing. But actually, there are all these active decisions and policies that go into it.
Choices about market structure. You know what I was thinking about was one of the things that we've talked about for a lot on the podcast is that after the great financial crisis, you know, the housing industry got hollowed out. All these home builders went out of business, et cetera. And now we're like faced with a big housing shortage, et cetera. What if there had been more coordination among home builders to curb both the upside and the downside, et cetera? Would that be more sustainable? Now, like people like would get really anxious about the idea of like any sort of like, you know, home builder coordination,
housing subsidies or whatever.
But when you look at the cost that we pay for boom bust cycles, you'll understand why some of these mechanisms get developed and blessed, at least for certain periods of time by the law, et cetera, because there is a price that you pay for boom busts over time. And so I think like these are actually like pretty interesting questions.
It is phenomenal that like we haven't done much for housing in that sense, but we have for raisins, right? There's a cartel or a cooperative that exists in order to smooth the boom-bust cycle in raisins.
Yeah.
It's funny, like the things that we pick as
I know.
socially important. All right, shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
This has been another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me at Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me at The Stalwart. Check out the book, Planet Money, A Guide to the Economic Forces That Shape Your Life by Alex Mayassi. Follow our producers, Carmen Rodriguez at Carmen Armin, Dashel Bennett at Dashbot, and Kale Brooks at Kale Brooks.
And for more Odd Lots content, you should check out our daily newsletter. You can find that at bloomberg.com/oddlots.
And you can chat about all of these topics 24/7 in our Discord, discord.gg/oddlots.
And if you enjoyed this conversation, then please leave a comment or like the video, or better yet, subscribe.
Thanks for watching.